Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. This is part 3 in a 3-part series on how to create a button-down shirt. In part 1, I went through all the supplies that we need for the project, the pattern that we used, and how to prep all of our pattern pieces to be constructed into the actual shirt. After cutting out all our pattern pieces, we did things like make the collar, prep our pockets, and construct the darts. So if you need to go back to video 1, please feel free to click the link that's up on the screen right now. In part 2 of this video series, we took all the pieces that we prepared in part 1 and put them together, building the basic shape of the shirt. We attached all the body pieces together, attached the collar, the facing, and basically prepped our shirt to be all the way done except for all the finishing techniques, which we will cover in video 3. In our last video for this series, we'll be doing things like slip stitching the collar onto the body of the shirt, creating our buttonholes, sewing on our buttons, completing the hem on both the sleeves and the bottom of the shirt, and attaching the pocket. Now let's get on the road together to work on finishing up our project. We're going to start by laying out the collar onto the ironing board, and I'm going to show you how we're going to slip stitch the neckline seam allowance up into the collar to create a really beautiful finished professional look. I'm going to start at center back and work my way outwards, pushing the neck seam allowance up into the collar, and then taking the open piece of my collar and folding it up about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. Then we're going to pin the open part of the collar onto the neck seam allowance. You want to start at center back and work your way outwards because otherwise your collar might end up twisted. After I've got center back pinned, I'm going to find my shoulder seam allowance and I'm going to snip it so it's free for me to push it in either direction. I'm also going to put a snip into my neck seam allowance at the same spot. Snipping the seam allowance not only allows you to lay it however you'd like to while you're doing your seam finishing, but it also stops it from pulling the garment and making it look weird from the outside. Once you've got your seam allowances snipped, go back to center back and work outwards toward the right hand side, pushing up the neck seam allowance into the collar and folding the collar under and pinning it in place to prepare for a slip stitch. Once we get to the end where the collar meets the facing, you should have left a 1/2 inch undone on that top of the facing part, and you're going to fold that under so that way that edge isn't raw. There's quite a few things happening right at this junction, which is why we clipped the seam allowance so we can push things in the direction we need them to go. But overall, our goal here is to make sure there's no raw seam allowance showing. So any seam allowance from the neck is getting pushed up into the collar, and then the edge of the facing is going to get folded under a 1/2 inch and stitched onto the seam allowance that created the shoulder seam. Our shoulder seam allowance is going to be pushed towards the outside of the garment. Once I've got everything pinned where I'd like it to be, I'm going to take my iron and just hit it with some steam real quick. That way I can make sure anything that's folded gets a line pressed in it and it stays folded. Then I'm going to take a hand sewing needle and prepare it with doubled thread with a knot at the end and get ready to complete my slip stitch. Now, if this is your first time completing a slip stitch, don't worry, I've got another video where I show you how to do a slip stitch nice and slow. So for this video, I'm not going to explain in huge depth how to do a slip stitch, but it's also called the tunnel and bite technique. I'm starting with that small strip of the facing that we folded under to lay on top of our shoulder seam allowance. The tunnel and bite technique means I'm going through the fold of the fabric, which is considered the tunnel, and then taking a bite out of whatever I'm stitching that tunnel to. In this case, it's the seam allowance. We don't want our bite to go all the way through to the front of the garment because then you're going to see some thread. We just have to sew through the seam allowance and then come back up, go back to the tunnel, go back for a bite, back to the tunnel, rinse and repeat. You can see here that I'm stitching just above the neck seam line, so that way again I'm only taking bites out of the seam allowance, not out of the body of the shirt, so we don't see any of our bites from the outside. You're going to keep doing your slip stitch until you're all the way at the other end with the other sides facing. Once you get to the end of the facing, you're going to tie a knot and cut off your thread. If at any point while you're doing the slip stitch you run out of hand sewing thread, you can tie a knot and just pick up where you left off. This is what my collar area looks like now that my slip stitches are completed. I think it looks really lovely once you've got a nice slip stitch and all your seam allowance covered up. We're going to move on to the hem of the shirt, and I'm going to be honest, this part can be a little bit tricky. We're going to do a rolled hem along the entire edge, but the edging of the shirt is curved, which makes it a little bit difficult. If you remember when we sewed on the facing, we sewed across the bottom part of the facing at about 1/2 inch. You're going to flip that right side out, and that basically sets up how high you're going to fold up the hem of the shirt. I'm using an iron and going along the entire bottom of the shirt and folding it up 1/2 inch and pressing it, and then folding it back in 1/4 inch and pressing it again. The pressing here is absolutely key. If you try to do this rolled hem on the machine without pressing it first, trust me, it's going to come out a complete hot mess. Even for me, who's been sewing a really long time, I can usually do a straight rolled hem with no pins, no pressing. I can whip it right through. This is one of those things you have got to press it first. Because of that curve, it goes up, it goes down. Please press it first. And just a quick reminder, if you struggle with rolled hems, if you look right above, there should be a link popping up on how to do rolled hems, and I dive a little bit deeper and show you in a bit more specifics how rolled hems work. We're going to work our way all the way around the hem of the shirt and get that rolled hem pressed in place. You can use as many pins as you'd like. And then one other suggestion I'd like to make is when you get to the side seam of the shirt where it kind of goes up and then back down, you may need to stretch that a bit when you go through the machine. It might need just a little bit of pull so that way it's not all bunched up in one area. If you're making the shirt on your own and you're like, you know what, I really just cannot do this rolled hem thing on the curve, it's too hard, by all means, you can cut the bottom of the shirt straight. But I hate to say it, if you're in one of my classes and you're getting this done for an assignment, you're not off the hook that easy. You do have to do the curved rolled hem. Once I've got all the pressing and the pinning I need done on the hem, I'm going to jump over to the machine and do one step that I forgot from the second video. I did not apply a seam finish to the armholes. So I'm just going to do a zigzag finish around each of the armholes. I'm going to clean up any little extraneous threads and just make sure those armholes are finished off really nice and elegantly. When sewing a situation like I've got on my machine right now, you want to constantly be checking underneath the needle because fabric from other areas of your project can very easily kind of like sneak in there, and then all of a sudden you've sewn, I don't know, the bottom of your shirt to underneath your sleeve, and that's not good. Once you've finished off your armholes, we're going to return to the edge of the shirt, and we're going to stitch down our rolled hem all the way along the bottom of the shirt. So again, if you have any trouble with a rolled hem, I have another video on my channel that shows you exactly how to complete a rolled hem, but I'm going to go through this process a little on the quicker side since it is a bit tedious. One reminder when you do a rolled hem is you want your stitching to be right along the fold that's at the top of the rolled hem. You don't want to be in the middle. You don't want to be at the bottom of the shirt. You want to be along the fold at the top, and that's how you make your rolled hem look the cleanest and the most professional. As I'm sewing along, I want you to see two things that I'm doing. One, right now I'm at that corner that I say I can get bunched up a little bit. I'm going to pull just very easily, very gently, just spread the fibers out a bit. That'll help get through that corner without getting any bumps. And you might have to pull a little bit in other areas of the curve. That's really okay. You're going to flatten that part out when you go back to iron it. And then the second thing is you'll see me stop a lot to kind of like readjust with my fingers. That's okay too. If you need to just, readjust your rolled hem, make sure it looks perfect before it goes under that needle. No one's forcing it under that needle. So if you need to stop, readjust, and then sew it, I'd rather you get it right and take your time the first time than have to rip it out and do it again. Once you've made your way all the way around the shirt, feel free to put it to the iron and give that hem one last final press. Like I said, you might have a couple of bumps, a little bit of twists. You're going to gently pull any areas that look like they're not perfectly flat and hit them with that iron, and that'll make your hem look absolute perfection. The next area in our shirt that's going to need some finishing is the sleeve hole. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a seam finish to the entire edge of both of my sleeves. Now there's a bunch of different ways you can finish off your sleeve. You could add a cuff, you could do a rolled hem, you could do a slip stitch, but what I am choosing to do is to add a folded cuff, and I'm going to demonstrate that for you. But if you choose to finish your sleeve in a different way, by all means, finish it in whichever way makes you happy. Here I am with my sleeve at the ironing board, and it goes without saying that I finished both sleeves. I'm going to give it a quick press because, pressing just is magic. It makes everything better. And I am going to take the edge of the sleeve and I'm going to fold it upwards 2 inches. I like to play a game with myself to see how close to a measurement I can get without using a ruler. So let's see, did I get 2 inches right? I also love that the sun hit like right there. I think it's super cute. Yeah, it's pretty close to 2 inches. It's a little short on the bottom. It's more like 1 3/4 inches on the bottom. So I'm going to fix that. But I love when I can get measurements like almost perfect. So I'm making sure that I've turned the cuff inward 2 inches all the way around. And I'm going to press that nice and flat. Once you've got your sleeve pressed to your liking, I've got it pressed at 2 inches all the way around. I'm going to do a whip stitch to hold that sleeve in place. A whip stitch is a really simple hand sewing technique where you can just hold something in place very gently. And if you've never done a whip stitch before, again, I've got another video that shows you in depth how to complete a whip stitch if you just click the link above. As with many hand sewing techniques, your goal is to show as little thread as possible, especially on the outside. So you're going to employ that bite technique that we use in the tunnel and bite. But we don't have a tunnel here, so we just try to hide our thread underneath the fold of the fabric. Once you've gone all the way around both armholes, we're ready for the next step. If you've got any little bit of gathering or puckering like I've got here, because my fabric doesn't have much stretch to it, please feel free to hit that with an iron. But in the end, you're not really gonna see it because we're gonna fold the cuff the other way and it'll cover it up. As you can see here, the edge of the sleeve is actually already finished off, but I really wanna put a cute little cuff on it, so I'm gonna now fold back the edge of the sleeve about 1 1/4 inches. Once it's folded back and measured properly, you're going to press it with the iron and make sure that your cuff is nice and crisp. When I fold the sleeve back a bit, you can see where you did your whip stitch holding the rough edge of the sleeve inside. So you ended up with a beautiful cuff finishing off your sleeve. To hold the cuff folded in place, I tend to do just a straight stitch on the machine at the underarm seam. Now, some people will do a slip stitch all the way around the arm cuff, but for me, I'm fine with just doing a stitch here at the bottom. Moving on from sleeves to buttonholes. I really love how in my fabric the suns ended up right down the center front of the shirt. You should have a pattern piece that's going to give you marks for your buttonholes. That's labeled piece 17. Now, as I pin that piece in place and get ready to mark my buttonholes, I want to let you guys in on a little bit of a theater secret. Now, I consider myself more of a costume designer than a fashion designer. And in costume design, we don't really do a lot of buttonholes. Buttonholes are really difficult to get on and off, and they make quick changes take longer. And I have situations actually in the show right now where people have 15 seconds to change. So most of the time, if you're watching a show and a shirt has buttons on it, it's fake. There's a snap behind it or Velcro. Once I've got piece 17 accurately pinned down the front of the shirt, I'm going to fold it backwards at each of the buttonholes marked on the pattern piece. I'm going to then take my tailor chalk and I'm going to mark where each button is going to be placed. So my little spiel before was just my way of saying that buttonholes are not exactly my forte. I don't have to do a lot of them because of the way we construct theater garments. And I actually had to look up a couple of videos on how to complete a buttonhole. So I'm going to attach below the video I used to create the buttonhole, but I suggest you do the same and look up a video according to your sewing machine so you know exactly how to create a buttonhole. Since the chalk is difficult both for me to see and for you to see through the video, I also placed a pin horizontally on top of where the buttonhole should end, just so I know where I'm starting and stopping when I put this under the machine. So when you're finished, you should have 5 buttonholes marked, and we're ready to go over to the machine and create our buttonholes. On my sewing machine, which is a Singer 4423 heavy duty, I'm going to start by taking off the presser foot. My machine comes with a specific buttonhole foot, which makes things actually a lot easier. See this little white guy? That's my presser foot. I'm going to take my button and I'm going to slide it into the end, and that helps tell the machine exactly how long to make my buttonhole. It attaches just like a regular presser foot would. Now I'm going to make a very strong recommendation that I hope all of you at home will take to heart. Please do a couple of practice buttonholes before you go straight to your garment. Buttonholes are an absolute nightmare to rip out of your garment. So get your fabric, put some interfacing on the back like I have here, and do a couple of practice buttonholes first. It won't add that much time to your project, and you'll be a lot happier making sure your buttonholes are perfectly done than having to rip one out. In order to create a buttonhole on my machine, as you can see on the left, I had to pull down that little lever that says push, and I have to push it backwards. That tells my machine it's buttonhole time. I also have some settings on the right-hand side, like the width and the length, that I have to have set again in order to tell my machine it's buttonhole time. So you can see here I've got a beautiful clean buttonhole, and this honestly took me about 4 or 5 tries to get it perfect how I wanted it to be. So again, please do a practice run first before you put your buttonholes into your shirt. Don't forget, we need to add the hole and buttonhole. So I have a pair of nail scissors. That's what I use for anytime I need to be cutting like really small things. So I cut just the middle of the fabric in the buttonhole, and I don't worry about cutting all of the fabric out, like trying to cut towards the actual sewing part. I just cut a straight line, and that way any extra fibers will fray themselves out. If you start trying to cut all of that fabric away, you're inevitably going to cut into the buttonhole threading, and then your buttonhole is going to come apart and it's going to be a big old mess. Once you're satisfied with your sample buttonhole, you're ready to do the rest of the buttonholes on your shirt. Now, I don't think you need to see the entire 5-minute video of me doing all 5 buttonholes on my shirt, but here's doing the first one. I'm making sure that I line up the hole of the buttonhole foot with the very back end of my line that I've made for my buttonhole, because the buttonhole moves towards the back of the item, goes across the back, and then moves back towards you. So I'm going down, buttonhole goes across, and then when that little button, that push button gets hit, it tells the machine to move back forward again. And there we go, I've got a beautiful buttonhole. Now that all my buttonholes are complete, it's time to put the buttons on to make sure that they're lined up with the buttonholes. And I recently found out that some of my students were really nervous about this part. They're afraid that they're gonna put their buttons in places that aren't going to line up with the buttonholes. And there's actually very, very easy ways to make sure that your buttons line up perfectly with your buttonholes. So I'm gonna show you one of those ways. For this method, I've taken both sides of my shirt and I've laid them on top of each other to make sure they're nice and even on the ironing board, and I pin them in place. The buttonhole side of the shirt should be facing me. Then what I do is I take a pin and I push it through the actual buttonhole. So for each 5 buttonholes, I push 1 pin through the buttonhole directly onto the other side of the shirt. And you want your buttonhole pin marker to be all the way at the right-hand side of the buttonhole, not in the middle, all the way to the outer part of the shirt. Once that step is completed, I'm going to very gently take the top layer of the shirt away, making sure I don't move any of the pins. So basically pushing the ball of the pin through the hole. So I'm going to take the top layer away, and the pins that are left behind are perfectly marking where all of our buttons should go. Now we're back to do some hand sewing, and we're going to hand sew on our buttons. See how I've got my pins perfectly marking where my buttons should go? And again, you should have 5 buttons total, and there's enough at the bottom if you wanted to add a 6th. Now, one of my goals with my channel was to build up a big enough library of basic skills videos so that when you do a more complicated tutorial like this, I'm not stopping for every single basic skill and showing you how to do it. So what's going to pop up above is a video specifically on how to sew on buttons. There's a few different type of buttons, and in my case in this video, I'm using a shank button, but you might be using a 2-hole or a 4-hole button. So I'd recommend, if you've never sewn on a button before, that you just click that link, take a quick view at how to sew on a button properly, and then come back to this project so you can make sure you sew your buttons in a way that they won't go falling off on you. So hopefully it goes without saying, you're gonna go ahead and repeat this step 5 times and sew on all of your buttons down the front of your shirt. The great news is, once you've sewn on all of your buttons, we're on the last step of our project and you're almost at the finish line. Our last step is attaching our pocket. I'm giving the front of the shirt a quick press, but you're not gonna get it perfectly flat because don't forget you've got your dart there. Hopefully you remember, way back in video 1, we did some prep work to our pocket to make it ready for this moment. So it was the first thing we worked on, and it's gonna be the last thing we work on. Again, with everything being black in my project, it's a little bit difficult to see where I'm lining things up, but the markers I want you to look for is the bottom right-hand corner of the pocket is going to line up with the tip of the dart. So that's where I'm starting, and I'm just making sure that my pocket's nice and straight, and I'm gonna pin it at all 4 corners. Now that I'm here at the sewing machine, I'm gonna start at the right-hand top side of the pocket. I'm gonna stitch straight down the right-hand side using a stitch length of 3. Once I get to the bottom, I'm gonna sink my needle, lift my presser foot, and turn 90 degrees. I'm gonna sew a straight stitch across the bottom of the pocket. I'm gonna do the same thing when I hit the other corner, sink my needle and lift my presser foot and turn my pocket 90 degrees. And then I'm gonna finish up my pocket by sewing straight back up to the top and doing a very small back stitch at the top of the pocket. And just as a small FYI, the pocket's totally optional. You can have 1 pocket, 2 pockets, or no pockets. It's up to you. To finish up your pocket, I go to the backhand side and I pull my thread so a little loop appears, and that allows me to pull the thread that's from the front through to the back. I take those 2 threads and I tie them together in a knot. So that way the thread is knotted and it's not knotted in the front. It just makes the garment, again, look a little bit more professional, and it gives it a nice clean touch instead of having little fuzzy threads hanging off the front. Once I've done that technique on one side of the pocket, go ahead and do it on the other side of the pocket. The only reason I have it underneath the presser foot on the sewing machine is to hold it in place while I'm tying. I'm not physically sewing anything with the sewing machine. It just acts as an anchor, so that way the fabric doesn't wiggle around on me while I'm tying the knots. Now, if you've made it through all 3 videos in this series and completed this button-down shirt, I want to offer you a huge congratulations, because a button-down shirt is a fairly complicated garment, and it's not something your average beginner sewer can accomplish. So great job if you made it this far. Once you've buttoned your shirt, it should lay nice and flat. If you notice that there's any kind of puckering between where your buttons and your buttonholes meet, go back and move that button so that way they do lay nice and flat. And once I've got the shirt on a form, I can know where the collar is going to naturally lay flat. So I'm taking an iron to just press the collar, press the notches, so that way they'll stay in place. And here's our completed button-down shirt. I really love the print that I chose. I think the celestial print is really cute with all the little arrows and dots to it. I plan on using this shirt as a pajama shirt, and hopefully in the next few weeks I'll be able to post a matching pajama short video, so that way you can make a completed set and give it to somebody for the holidays. If you've completed this shirt, you've been able to learn a variety of sewing techniques like buttonholes, arm cuffs, box pleats, and yokes. So again, congratulations for completing your amazing project. So again, thank you so much for stopping by Meghan Grace DIY. I really hope I was able to teach you something today. And if you stumbled across this video first, I'll have the links for video 1 and video 2 in the description section below. If you want to learn more about me, you're more than welcome to check me out on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. Instagram, I'd say, is the best one because that's where I announce any type of contests or giveaways that are coming up. And it goes without saying, if you haven't already, please make sure you hit that subscribe and the notify button. I hope to see you soon, and happy sewing!